Welcome back, adventurers. So you need a full D&D campaign setting, but you're short on time because you completely forgot, and you want something that feels real and it feels immersive, but you also want it to be flexible. Well, don't worry, we're going to craft an entire campaign setting right now, step by step, and by the end, you'll have a world, hopefully, that your players will want to explore and maybe set on fire. So let's dive in. Now, first up, you need a world. Now, this is where you get to decide, is it something that's already established like Faerun or Eberron, or is it a homebrew campaign? And for me, my campaigns are all set in my homebrew world of Maladea, but for you and for this video, let's start fresh. Now, here's the trick. You don't need to map the entire planet right now. Just give it a name, something that fits the tone of your world. So for this one, I'm gonna make up a completely new world and I'm gonna call it Arden. Now you want to think about the tone, because now that you have the name, you really want to think about sort of what emotions this world is going to elicit from your players. What sorts of images is it going to bring up in their minds? And you really want to know what that is from the very beginning. The reason that this is really important is because it's literally the first impression that your players are going to get. So for this one, we're going to call it a high fantasy world, but we're going to keep it a little grounded. So magic is rare, but it's very powerful. And this world is recovering from the fall of the Velkin Empire. I literally just made that up. We're going to say that the Velkin Empire is an arcane kingdom that crumbled to a curse and left behind all of their ruins, and nobody knows what that curse is. Now, even just by having that single sentence or that 2-sentence breakdown, whatever you want to call that, I'm already thinking about so many different hooks and stories, like who are the Velkins to begin with? What were they like? Were they even human? I can set an entire story in one of the ruins alone, or I can set a story with one of their ancestors, right? By like thinking about who might have survived this fall of their empire. And if I really wanted to go even further, one of the players, one of them can find a cursed item from a Velkin ruin and maybe introduce that to the greater world, and that becomes your main hook or your big bad or whatever. And there's just so many things that can start happening when you start to flesh out even just a little corner, like who lived here a long time ago. All right, moving on. Next, we need the starting location. And this is where your players are going to spend the early game. So it needs to feel the most fleshed out. Now, I personally highly recommend that you start with a small town. So if you're new to D&D or if you're a new dungeon master, I would just recommend starting small. It's just going to be way easier for you, I promise. But if you decide you'd rather hate yourself, then you can ignore me and go for a city or a metropolis. And really all you have to do for that is scale up the points of interest to the size of a city. But I'm telling you, it gets a lot more difficult to run. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Now for this task, for the starting location, we're going to go small. So I decided to come up with a small village. We're going to call it Valenth, and it's nestled in this green and fertile valley. A small town keeps it simple, but the valley itself leaves a lot of opportunities for adventure. Now, Valenth, we'll say, is surrounded by rolling hills, golden fields, and a dark and mysterious forest, and we're going to call that forest Whisperwood. Now, if your players want to leave, that's totally okay. You can have neighboring towns ready to explore, but for right now, Valenth is going to be our home base. Now, when creating a town, you want to consider a few things, so let's build it up and flesh it out just a little bit. So, the first thing we want to think about is the town's purpose. Every town has a reason to exist. Valenth, we're just going to say Valenth is a farming community, which means that there's got to be a larger town or a city nearby that Valenth is supplying, right? Otherwise, why would the empire or kingdom or whoever build this town in the first place? So for this, let's keep it short and sweet. Valenth is supplying grain, apples, and ale. And its fields are famous for a golden wheat called sungrain. Literally just made that up. And sungrain helps the local taverns brew the region's beloved ale, and we're going to call that the Golden Draft. But the town is also a crossroad. So there's a few roads leading from different areas of the kingdom that all sort of converge here. So there's a lot of travelers heading to larger towns and into the untamed wilderness, and there's merchants that pass through regularly, which means that they bring goods from all over the world and also stories. And that kind of leads us to the next thing that you want to think about, which is the population. When we're thinking about population, what I like to do is I like to close my eyes and sort of imagine what the town looks like from above. So how many buildings do I see? How big are the buildings? Are there any buildings that stand out, like a cathedral or something like that? Or is it just a really small rural community? Now, for every building that you see in your head, try to imagine that there's probably 2 to 5 people living and working there. So this means that you need to think about their homes and their places of work. Well, luckily, Valenth is small, right? Trying to keep this easy for myself. So we're going to say that there's about 200 people. It's just a small town. And all in all, that means that there's roughly 40, I sound Irish, 40 all in all, there's roughly about 40 to 50 buildings in Valenth, and that includes their homes, that includes their businesses, and their community spaces. Now, what I like about this is that it keeps the town small enough to feel intimate, but it also is big enough with a few hundred people to support a variety of characters and activities. So out of all those buildings, those 40 to 50, we can say that about 30 of them are houses, and most of them are going to be small houses with little gardens and maybe some fields nearby. All of the rest of the buildings, the 20 or so buildings, are businesses or their workspaces, and maybe there's a few community locations. So right now, here's where we're at. We have the world, Arden, and we have the starting location, Valenth. So now what you do, or at least what I do, is write down a quick and easy description of the town. So for this, I would write something like, Valenth is a small farming community that's known for its golden wheat, its famous ale, and its role as a crossroads for travelers. It's a quiet place with hardworking people. It's surrounded by rolling fields and a nearby forest that holds its fair share of mysteries at the base of greater mountains. That's it. Don't overthink it at this point. Just get the basics down so you're ready to move on. And then from here, we can start to fit in more of those details to bring Valenth to life. But just that little description gives me so much. I know that there's fields, I know that there's a forest, and I know that beyond the forest, there's mountains. So that gives me sort of a layered understanding of this place so that I know that if players wanted to travel, I know that if they leave the town, they might be moving towards a field. Maybe after that, they move towards a forest, and maybe after that, they move into the mountains. So now that gives me 3 sorts of stages to think about in my head while I'm role-playing, while I'm improvising, right? So now that we've got the world and the starting location sort of pinned down, now we need to give the place some personality, right? This is the thing that's going to make it stand out. And the best way to do that is by adding some points of interest and some key figures. These will be sort of the landmarks and people that your players are going to interact with the most. So let's build those up next. So first of all, let's go to the points of interest. For Valenth, we're going to keep things simple but memorable. So think about the essential places that every small village needs, right? You don't need a dozen locations, just enough to keep things engaging without overwhelming your players, right? That's the goal here. You just want to seem prepared without overwhelming yourself. So first, every adventuring party needs a place to rest. So we're starting with the Golden Sheaf Tavern. This is the heart of the village. This is where the locals are going to gather to gossip. Travelers are going to share some of their tales of the road, and it's a really good place to drop an NPC with the quest hook, right? You all meet in a tavern as a trope for a reason. So after the tavern, after the Golden Sheaf, we have the blacksmith's forge, and we can say that this forge is run by a dwarf whose name is Harlan, and he's a retired dwarf adventurer. He's missing a leg, and now he spends his days repairing tools and crafting the occasional weapon, but he really misses the old days. And he's seen the whole world basically, so he has lots of stories to tell, which makes him a really good source of rumors and a good source of advice for the party. And honestly, it's just a good recipe for a beloved NPC. So just by dropping a blacksmith here, I've already started to think about who the owner is and how this NPC might fit into the story, or how he might be a resource for the player, since there really aren't that many in a small town, right? Now after that, then we have the general store, which is just a place where the villagers and the travelers are going to stock up on essentials. So to make it a little unique, I'm going to say that this is run by a cheerful halfling couple who knows everything about everyone in the town, and they're always super quick to offer advice and to stick their noses into everybody's adventuring business. And that little quirk, I feel like, just makes them unique, and it makes them memorable, and it also just sounds like a lot of fun to roleplay at the table. Now for something a little more mysterious, we're going to put a temple in the town, and this is a temple of Lysa. That's just a name I made up. I don't know if that's a real goddess or a god or whatever. I just made that up. You can decide what this temple is, right? So it's a small town, so it's not going to be this spectacular temple. Instead, it's going to be this modest little shrine, maybe a small building that's dedicated to this goddess. I'm going to say that because this is a small town that's agricultural, that she is the goddess of harvests. That makes sense to the town, right? I don't want these people worshiping something that absolutely makes no sense to their region, but just for fun, to add a little extra layer to the temple, I'm going to also say that there's a thieves guild presence here that's running their business from inside the temple, and that maybe the people that work the temple are sort of in on that. And then just because I like to also have something sort of at or around the city borders, then there's the Whisperwood Forest that's just sitting outside the village, and it's this dark and ancient woodland that's rumored to be haunted or rumored to be cursed, and it's sort of the perfect place for your players to stumble upon their big adventure, right? Like it's a good place to drop the big hook. So in just a few minutes, by thinking about only the location and that it's an agricultural valley, we have a town. I know the shops, and we've sort of related some of the names of the shops to the area and the fields and their sort of culture. We know a few of the characters already, and we even have some threads to pull on for random encounters, because when you think about everything we just listed, we have a thieves guild in a temple. There's a retired adventurer. There's a tavern with merchants that can serve as our quest magnet if we need that. And there's also a forest with a dark side that pretty much any party is going to want to explore. So at this point, you should have enough for players to feel like this town has some depth without really needing to overcomplicate it, but we're better than that. So we're going to go deeper, and we're going to add key figures to populate these locations. So who are the people that will make Valenth feel alive? Let's start with somebody I just made up, Mayor Rorik Gannett. Sort of a weird name there. We're going to say that he's a former mercenary, he turned leader, and genuinely cares for the town's well-being, but he's very pragmatic, he's very direct, and if there's trouble, he's the first person to ask for help, or he just goes and grabs the sword himself. So there's the mayor, sort of gives you an idea of how the town is run, right? And then there's Harlan Ironfoot, the blacksmith that we talked about. And he has all of these tales from his adventuring days, and he has this twinkle in his eye every time he talks about the good old days. And over at the temple, we have Sister Evelyn, who is this very soft-spoken and kind woman, but she probably knows more about the Thieves Guild activities than she lets on when she first meets the players. And then finally, we have sort of a wild card. We're going to call him Varric. Varric is a mysterious traveler that's staying at the Golden Sheaf, and he's keeping to himself, but he's been seen guarding this locked chest, and he's very clearly hiding something. Maybe he's running from trouble, or if you want to go the other way, you can say that he is bringing it with him, right? Somebody's looking for this chest. And just by adding these NPCs, literally just 4 names, you already have personalities tied to your locations, and they provide you with hooks, and they provide your players with a way to interact with the world. And now this town has people that aren't just window dressings, they're tools that you can use for storytelling, which kind of brings us to the next part, and that's our adventure hooks. So now we're at the point where we can layer in some mysteries and some conflicts. So the next thing that I like to do is to pick 1 or 3 adventure hooks so that your players have a little bit of freedom and that you have a little bit of freedom in the direction that you want to go. So what's happening in Valenth? What would grab your players' attention? Maybe the Thieves Guild is smuggling artifacts from the Whisperwood Forest through the temple. So that's something that you might be able to drop in as a hint if your players visit the temple. Maybe the livestock have been disappearing and there's these strange tracks that nobody's ever seen before that are leading to the forest edge. Well, now you have a reason to visit the forest, and that could be a creature, that could be a person, it could be somebody impersonating a monster, right? There's so many ways that you could do that. And then maybe this Varric person that has this locked chest, maybe that chest contains a Velkin relic, and he's really desperate to keep it hidden. So that's already a few different mysteries that you can sort of give to your players, and it gives them a reason to care about Valenth, right? It gives them a reason to push toward uncovering something larger about the world around them. And when you have that, and they're also becoming best friends with Harlan and these nosy as shit halflings that sell, their 1,000 caltrops to these people and their healing potions, well, now the town is starting to become memorable. So really quick, let's just take stock, right? We've got the world, Arden. It is a high fantasy but grounded world that's recovering from the fall of the Velkin Empire. Then there's the starting location, Valenth, and it's this small farming community that's known for its wheat, its ale, the crossroads. It's quiet, it's got hardworking people surrounded by fields and a forest, and then there's a fair share of mysteries at the base of these greater mountains. Then we have its purpose. This town is a crossroads. It supplies its community with grain and wheat and apples and ale to other towns, right? Through merchants that leave this town and bring that stuff over to other towns. There's about 200 hardworking villagers. They're mostly farmers. There's a couple of craftspeople, there's merchants, and then a lot of curious outsiders that stop here. And then we have our points of interest. So we have the Golden Sheaf Tavern, we have Harlan's Forge, we have the General Store, the Temple of Lysa, and then the Whisperwood Forest. Those are 5 points of interest that you can use to sort of guide your players. And then our key figures, we have Mayor Rorik Gannett, we have Harlan Ironfoot, we have Sister Evelyn, and Varric the Stranger. From here, we can kind of jump into the next step, and that's the local realm, because at this point you should have enough to just play around with and get your players interacting with the town. So now the next thing you want to think about, because we have a decent starting point, but we didn't start a video about making a town, we're talking about an entire campaign setting, and because you're like me and your crippling anxiety makes you feel the need to be overly prepared for absolutely no sane reason, we're going to talk about how to build up the local realm. So when you think about Valenth's place in the world, like I mentioned earlier, it's a farming community that is giving to a wider kingdom. So that means that nearby there's got to be a city and there's got to be a king. So that means there's a lord nearby and also a keep where this lord lives. And that gives us a few more bullets to add. So we have Holden's Keep, and I just made that up, which is probably a day away because it's going to be close enough for the lord to travel. And at that keep, we have Lord Wylan Holden. And he is the person that owns sort of the entire existence of this town, right? This town lives to serve that lord. And we also know that somewhere in this amorphous world that we've created together, there's a capital city with a king, and you get to decide how far away that king is. I'm going to say that this king's name is King Tristram. So why do we go through that work? Well, because now we have a few more points of interest. So let's consider what those might be doing to our story. And by that, I mean, how can we create conflict or intrigue by thinking about those bullets? Well, the villagers of Valenth might resent their high taxes that are being demanded by Lord Wylan and his soldiers. And so now, just by saying that, you're stoking this sort of small ember for this potentially bigger story. So if you want something bigger than that, then maybe there's rumors of this growing unrest at Arden's Crown, right? Which, can be the capital city or whatever. And then because of that, there's whispers of this rebellion, or maybe there's a foreign enemy moving into Pounce. Just by knowing that, now you look like a DM that knows everything about the town and that you were super prepared, and you're starting to get a bigger picture of the world beyond this small town's borders. Well, now your brain is going and you can start to find places to improvise or to pivot, and you can start writing down notes and bullets as they come up, and you can even use these things that players are saying or they're doing and start to fill in gaps that you weren't sure existed and you didn't know who would be this person or who would be that. And you can start to plug those in and start to fill that world in yourself and just try to solve those mysteries as the players are making their guesses, because a lot of that world building that we're doing is done for us by the players, because sometimes they come up with things that are better than what we thought, and you can just replace what you originally thought by saying like, no, that's better. I'm going to make this person the bad guy because they think it's the bad guy, even though it's just an NPC, but now that's cool. And that's what I meant at the very beginning when I said that you don't need to overcomplicate it. You just need to sort of cast a wide net when you're thinking about these things and pull it in when you have a thread to pull on. So let's take a look at this updated breakdown of what we've built. We've got the world of Arden, the starting location of Valenth, the purpose of this town, which is that it's an agricultural community and a crossroads with a population of 200. The points of interest are the tavern, the forge, the general store, the temple, and this forest nearby. We've got the mayor and Harlan and Sister Evelyn and Varric, but now we also have Lord Wylan and King Tristram. Then you have the local realm, which is Holden's Keep, a day away, and Arden's Crown, the capital city of the kingdom, which is probably 2 or 3 days away. Maybe it's on the other side of the kingdom if you want to. Now from here, we can start to flesh out the greater kingdom, and that helps give your players just a sense of the larger sort of geopolitical structure. And we're going to define some factions and some conflicts, and then we're going to look at like far off lands and just make Arden feel very expansive, even though we are just coming up with this in like maybe an hour's time. Now, since this video is all about building a campaign setting quickly and you don't have time to be thinking about maps and descriptions and music, why not leave that to somebody else? Give me just a little bit less than a minute and I'm going to tell you about today's sponsor, Describe. Look, I get it. You want to be the DM that blows everyone's mind. You want to have a session so good that players can't stop bragging about you. But sadly, it just never happens. You put all of that work in and they just do their thing. They eat their pizza and they go home with a see you next week gang. Well, here's the trick to taking your session from just another week to holy that gave me the chills. Describe is a platform where the DM gets one subscription. Literally, if every player chipped in the price of a coffee, you could play for a whole year. And the DM builds these incredible immersive soundscapes with maps and text and ambience and music and sound effects all right there in one spot for all of the players to experience right there. And if you want to check out what I mean, click the link down below and use my code FANTASYFORGE. I literally got chills the first time I was being run through the program. I can't even imagine what it must be like for players the first time. So go check out Describe. You won't regret it. It's the secret trick you've been looking for. And if your players don't lose their minds the first time you introduce it to them, then honestly, they just don't deserve you. All right, now that we've got the local realm tied into the world, it's time to sort of expand the scope, and we're going to talk about now the greater kingdom. And this is where your players begin to realize that their small town is part of something much larger, an interconnected world. And don't freak out, because you don't have to detail every single corner of the map. Just adding a few major elements is going to make your setting feel super expansive, make it feel super alive. Now, let's start with the kingdom itself. The kingdom of Arden, like like I said earlier, is ruled by King Tristram. He's charismatic, but he's aging, and he's struggling to hold things together. Nobody thinks he's strong enough. His rule is starting to get challenged on multiple fronts. There's rebellious nobles, there's rumors of foreign invaders, and to make it worse for him, there's whispers of this ancient power that's stirring in the ruins of the Velkan Empire. So now you can introduce new NPCs from each of those various powers. So let's look at sort of the factions and power groups of the Greater Kingdom. So the Greater Kingdom is obviously going to have powerful people living in it. So I like to think about these groups and try to think who holds the influence in the kingdom. You don't need a lot. You just need maybe 3 or 4. That's plenty. But each of them should have a clear role and agenda. So here's how I approached it. So I asked myself, who holds the real power in the kingdom? So for the first group, I came up with something really straightforward. That's the royal court. This is the king's inner circle. There's nobles, there's advisors. Each of them has their own ambitions. They're loyal or not to the king, and their actions could start to affect the entire kingdom, because if you have one of these nobles who is going to be powerful if they're sitting on a royal court, and maybe one of these or 2 of these or all of them are conspiring against the king, well, now you have conflict in that circle within itself, and you can kind of decide how many people are in this court. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 7, and all you have to do is pick one, give them a unique voice, and give them something that sets them apart, and a conflict. Maybe they hate the king and they're trying to kill him. Maybe they're working with these foreign powers. Now you have conflict that can stoke the fires, and your players can sort of discover that. And then the second thing, I wanted sort of an economic force, so I came up with the Merchants Guild, and this is a group that controls the trade and the wealth across the kingdom, and you can plant this Merchants Guild. Maybe they have a small base of operations in Valenth, and so because of that, their influence can be felt even in small towns, just to kind of get your players understanding who this Merchants Guild is and give them a reason to visit the city if they wanted to be a part of that, or investigate the guild or something. And then for something shadowy, I added the Velkan Remnant. And this is a group that is super obsessed with arcane legacy, or the arcane legacy of the fallen Velkan Empire. So they're hunting for ruins and they're hunting for artifacts. And this ties really neatly into the mysterious elements of the world. And you can decide whether they're looking for these ruins and these artifacts for a good reason or a bad reason, but maybe the king sees them as bad. So that's where you can start to get into like sort of the weeds of the different groups and stuff, because maybe they're not wrong. Maybe the king is the bad guy, even if he is charismatic. And then, you know, as they get to know people of the Velkan Remnant, maybe you realize that they're just trying to fight for themselves. Maybe they're a small group of people that are looking for a home. You can decide how to do that. Like even the name, the Velkan Remnant, if your players hear that, they're gonna be like, oh, those are bad guys. But as the role playing goes on, maybe they realize, oh, maybe they're not. And that's where you can decide how straightforward or how gray you want the story to be. And then the last thing I wanted was something of a military presence. So I created the Iron Vanguard, and that's gonna be the kingdom's army. They're super loyal to the king, but they're stretched very thin by all of these border skirmishes that are happening. So a lot of the city's soldiers have left, and we are left with city guard, and that's where maybe the noble is paying the city guard to turn a blind eye to certain crimes and maybe letting people in and out of the castle. So we've got 4 groups, right? The Royal Court for politics and intrigue, we've got the Merchants Guild for wealth and trade, and the Velkan Remnant for magic and mystery, and the Iron Vanguard for the military strength. Now each one of them has a purpose, and you can decide how much or how little they're going to interact with your players. But once you have your factions, then you can think about adding 1 or 2 more NPCs for each group, and you don't need names or full backstories yet, you just need their roles. So someone in the Royal Court is scheming, and there's another one that's a trusted advisor, or maybe that's the same person. And then there's the Merchants Guild, who has an ambitious representative that's pushing to take control over Valenth's resources. Maybe they're sending people to Valenth and that's how they meet them. There's the Velkan Remnant that might have a very specific zealot that's searching for this ancient magic, and that could be your big baddie. And then you have the Iron Vanguard that might have a captain that's stationed near Valenth who's dealing with local threats, and that kind of gives you an in into the Iron Vanguard and into another story that you can have there. So to make the Greater Kingdom feel alive, you also want to introduce some overarching conflicts. And the thing to remember here is that the hooks and conflicts are part of bigger arcs. These hooks and conflicts in the starting location are going to be different hooks than the ones that we're doing right now, because the ones that we have at the very beginning are the hooks that we're going to pull on for a while, and you can pull on them for a long while, many sessions if you do it right. And the whole time you can be setting up the conflicts for the larger kingdom and even dropping hints of the big baddie throughout that time. So here's how I come up with a few of my larger conflicts. So starting with the king, I figured like, well, what's happening with his rule? Why don't people like him? And I sort of liked the idea of a succession crisis. So maybe there's just no heir and lots of people want the throne, so you have a sort of Game of Thrones style thing going on. And then I decided to look at the greater borders of the kingdom. So now we're going to go to the edge of the map, or at least the country's map, and zoom out a little bit. And so I figured maybe these rumors of foreign invaders or these warlords are threatening the kingdom, but that's a great thing to plug in here. And I also love orcs, so maybe we have a few enemy kingdoms, and then there's also orcs and an orc horde somewhere. Then you can find a hook or a conflict that ties back to the Velkin Empire. So the Velkin Remnant is searching for artifacts, and they're uncovering something dangerous, and there's this platoon of soldiers that went on a recon mission that never came back to the city. And then lastly, you want to bring all of that home sort of to the starting location of Valenth. So the high taxes, the economic strain, all of that is maybe creating tension between the villagers and the kingdom's rulers, which in turn just makes them hate the lord and the king. And now you can start to see how there's sort of these stepping stones and these baby steps that are going to take the players from the starting location of Valenth and take them through to the ending location of the city, just by thinking about like how all of this interacts with each other. And that's, I think, where it gets really, really fun. And then the last thing we're going to look at is very, very broad and vaguely the world beyond. And so now it's time to zoom out just a little bit more and think about that world. I mean, literally the world of Arden. And that's where you can sort of add your depth and your scale to your setting and just start to plant seeds for other stories and other epic story arcs. And the key here is to not overwhelm yourself or your players. You are not trying to detail every single continent. You are not trying to do every single town that's in the world. If you want to do that, awesome, do that. I do that. I like that kind of detail. But you don't need that kind of detail. Instead, what you want to do is sort of give a sense that the world is vast, that it is alive, and that it has all this potential by just having a few names sort of in your pocket. So think about neighboring kingdoms, think about continents, and even think about other places, like other planes of existence. So who are the neighbors of this kingdom that we've created, which I just realized we don't have a name for this kingdom, so we're just going to call it the kingdom. Who are the neighbors of the kingdom? What relationships do they have? You know, are they good? Are they bad? For example, really quickly, I came up with a bunch of different countries. So I said that there's the Dusklands. There's this barren, war-torn region far to the east that is home to sort of like nomadic tribes that are like this ancient kingdom that doesn't exist anymore, and they don't like Arden. They occasionally raid across the border and stuff. And then there's the Sapphire Coast, which is way to the south, lots of trade, lots of cities, vibrant culture, and Arden is like kind of okay with them because they need their imports and stuff, but there's also tensions because the Merchants Guild is pissed off about tariffs or whatever. You can decide if you want to throw in politics. And then we have the Frozen Expanse way in the north, this icy wilderness where explorers go and never come back, and there's myths and stuff, and you know, you can have sort of that intrigue. And then the Eldertide Isles, which is sort of this scattered chain of islands across the sea that's home to pirates and exiles and nobles that ran away and strange magic and all this stuff. And that right there, just having those kind of places that like players can ask about these places, or they can ask, well, what's across the sea? And you can say, oh, well, I know that because it's the Eldertide Isles. And you look super prepared. You look like you've built a world, even though all you did was write it down. So now that you have that, sort of the larger world needs something that ties it together and something that can ripple across the borders and affect everyone. That's sort of the global threat, the big baddie, if you will. So for this, I decided that there's this intercontinental war that is about to happen. I think that would be really cool. So this kingdom's neighbors, the Sapphire Coast and the Dusklands, have erupted into war, and a lot of the battles have started to spill into local borders. There's been towns that maybe have been raided, and they're going to the king begging for help. And these sorts of broader events aren't necessarily going to take the center stage, but they are going to add a lot of flavor. They're going to increase stakes for the players, and it's going to give them something to think about, something to avoid, or maybe to uncover. And then finally, the last thing I like to do is sort of pick a handful of exotic lands. And these exotic lands are going to serve two purposes. It's going to expand the world, and it's also going to plant seeds for those future adventures. So what I'd like to do is pick places that are sort of weird and wild and strange. So for example, I came up with the Scorched Waste, and this is a desert land that's really, really far away, maybe another continent. It has all of these ancient ruins, all these sandstorms, and there's this rumor that the Velkins hid their darkest secrets there, and that's all that they know. And then there's the Shadowmere, which is this marshland where there's said to be sort of dangerous fae living there, and maybe I can throw in a hag if I really wanted to do something fun and lean into sort of the horror aspect. And then the Astral Nexus, which we're going to say is this sort of weird arcane phenomenon that's happening on the Sapphire Coast, or really in the oceans of the Sapphire Coast, and sailors say that it's this gateway to the stars. I don't even have to think more about that. Boom, that's it. You're done. Like, that's literally it. Once you have all of that, you have sort of a whole world that's fleshed out, and all it took me was maybe an hour by just being creative. So what do you do now? Well, first of all, take a breath because your campaign is basically ready to start. So it's cool because whether your players dive like head first into Valorant's local mysteries, or if they're setting their sights immediately on wanting to go explore the world, you have enough material that you can use to adapt, that you can use to improvise and build up as they play. And something that I want you to remember is that this world is going to grow with your players. Their choices, their victories, their failures, all of that is going to shape this world into something that is uniquely theirs and uniquely yours. And it's going to be so different than what you thought it would become. And that's just the truth, I promise you. And I think that's really part of the beauty of D&D, is that you're creating that story with somebody else, and that this world doesn't need to be fully fleshed out because you're going to do that at the table. And that's pretty much it. Again, this is not perfect. The idea here is that you continue to plug in and add more as the sessions go on. But I think that if you just sit down, you answer a few questions, you think creatively, and just sort of go with the flow, you can quickly start to put together a world without having to answer a million different questions. Now, I made a template for this outline because I figured some of you might be like me and you need an outlining tool. So if you want it, you can head over to the website. I'll link it there for free, and I'll link it down below. And you can use that for your own campaigns if you need to come up with something. Anyways, I hope this video helped. Let me know in the comments down below if you think I'm missing anything. And if you were paying attention, leave a timestamp in the comments down below with where you saw our little buddy Tobias in this video, and you might just get shouted out in the next video. As always, thank you so much for watching. Forge on, my friends, and we'll see you next time, adventurers.